Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed, most people were silent. Few people cried. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Welcome back to Bobby's Brain Dump. So it looks like we've finally hit a ceiling on Russia's escalate to de-escalate policy. Putin is now threatening everybody who speaks out against the Russian invasion of Ukraine with nuclear death. The US intelligence chief Avril Haines is also warning that Russia may see their defeat in Ukraine as an existential threat and may use weapons of mass destruction to pocket the win. But what are weapons of mass destruction? What does Russia have? And do I think they'd use them? And what would it look like if they did use them? Let's find out. Weapons of mass destruction are weapons that are the most indiscriminate killers. They have a huge impact, right? They have the capacity to kill millions of people. In fact, the way that you would measure casualties is referred to as megadeath. Not the awesome band, but the idea of counting the casualties in the millions. You have three categories of weapons of mass destruction. You've got chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons. Chemical weapons are a gas or easily vaporizable liquid that can cause chemical burns like mustard gas, or they affect the central nervous system like Novichok agents. Biological weapons harness the power of the greatest killer of all, Mother Nature. They generally take the shape of microbes like anthrax or smallpox. The star of the show, and what Russia has been leaning on since the fall of the Soviet Union, is nuclear weapons. The biggest big bomb that you can possibly drop. So what does Russia have? Well, they likely have all three. They definitely have nuclear weapons, because they won't shut up about it, and they have the largest stockpile of any country in the world. They probably still have stockpiles of chemical weapons, even though they officially destroyed them in 2017. Even though they've officially gotten rid of them, conflicts that have Russia's involvement also seem to have chemical weapons involved. And there's been some high-profile assassinations and attempts that have used Russia-specific chemical weapons, like Novichok. The last is biological weapons. Both the Soviets and the US had a lot of research and development into biological weapons. But in the 1960s, the US President Nixon nixed the program. The Soviets didn't believe this though, and they ramped up their research, and it was seen as one of the key defensive measures that the Soviet Union could use. There's not really any hard evidence for Russia maintaining bioweapon labs, but they have been accused of it, and previously they've shut down their bioweapon facilities, like Gorbachev shutting down bioweapon research in 1989, and then Yeltsin shuts them down in 92. So we'll start with chemical weapons. Chemical weapons were used extensively in World War I, but not really in any conflicts afterwards. After World War I, there was limited use. Famously, they've been used by Cuba, Iraq in the Iraq-Iran War, and Syria against its own population. So one of the classics of chemical warfare is mustard gas, which is a really powerful blistering agent. So if it gets on your skin or in your eyes, it will create these huge blisters that are incredibly debilitating. And if you breathe it in, it creates those blisters, but it also creates bleeding. The more recent types of chemical weapons that are still popular with these countries are agents like VX gas. Venomous Agent X is not a character from an anime, although it does sound like a badass name for one. It is a nerve agent that blocks communication through your central nervous system and leads to something called flaccid paralysis, which eventually will shut down your diaphragm and you just suffocate. As you'd imagine, a lot of these chemical weapons require very specific compounds and chemicals and technology to produce. And so a lot of that is controlled and monitored. The Soviet Union, to get around this, started research on what are called Novichok agents. The Soviet Union created Novichok agents to get around the restrictions on the precursors you'd need to make chemical weapons. And the use of Novichok agents have been a signature of Russian assassinations and espionage. Although Russia still denies any involvement, even though they're the only country that produces Novichok. So do I think Russia will use chemical weapons? No. Because they are the most effective against people that have no protection against them. And if you're a country that is being supported by the most advanced militaries in the world, they're going to be able to offer protection from chemical weapons. So chemical weapons would be the least likely to be used, because the main thing that would happen would be civilian casualties. The amount of chemical weapons that are needed to be effective are tons, hundreds, thousands of tons of chemical weapons. And the weather has to be right, and you need to make sure that the enemy isn't expecting it for it to be effective. And so if these conditions aren't met, then you're not really going to be effective against military targets. So let's move on to biological weapons. Now, there is an evidence for Russia's biological weapons, but there is an absence of evidence that they disposed of their biological weapons. So in the 1970s, the Soviet Union and 100 odd other countries signed the Biological Weapons Convention, which was basically there to say that biological weapons are bad and that everyone should get rid of them. And they had to make regular reports as to what was happening with their biological weapons, how they were disposing of them, and how many had been converted to other purposes. The Soviet Union and Russia have never been compliant on this, and there is evidence that throughout this whole period, they have been continuing research, but just under more secrecy. The biological weapons that Russia have kind of flown under the radar in terms of anybody accusing Russia of harboring weapons of mass destruction. We haven't really had discussions about this. The advantage for Russia using bioweapons is that they would be able to cast suspicions on Ukraine and NATO. The two most likely candidates for a bioweapon would probably be anthrax and smallpox. So the reason why anthrax might be used would be because it doesn't spread beyond the person. It's not very contagious. You catch it through spores. So anthrax is very survivable if it's treated. But the problem would be that you have a lot of people that need to be treated. And left untreated, the fatality rate goes much higher. An infection with anthrax can present in a lot of ways. If it lands on the skin, you get ulcers and relatively painless, but if you inhale it or ingest it, it can lead to a shortness of breath or nausea and vomiting, and can be quite debilitating. And then there's smallpox. If you're unvaccinated for smallpox, the fatality rate is incredibly variable depending on how the symptoms present. Ordinary smallpox has a fatality rate of 30%, but even if you survive, it can leave you horribly disfigured and injured. Smallpox infection creates a sheet of blisters that can join together and detach the skin. And then there's hemorrhagic smallpox, which instead of forming blisters, you just start bleeding into your skin. Hemorrhagic smallpox has a 100% fatality rate. And now we get to the star of the show, the belle of the ball. We get to nuclear weapons. Now, there are a range of nuclear weapons, all the way down from tactical nukes to hydrogen bombs. Hydrogen bombs are better for the environment. The main concern seems to be that Russia would use tactical nukes, so that's what we're going to focus on. So tactical nuclear weapons are smaller than strategic nuclear weapons, and they're designed to be used on the battlefield rather than destroying entire cities. A tactical nuclear bomb is still a nuke though, and the explosion is huge. So being a lot smaller, tactical nuclear weapons are easier to justify their use and harder to argue for some sort of retaliation. And this is why I think Russia is leaning on tactical nuclear weapons rather than massive strategic nuclear bombs. So to fully appreciate the difference between a tactical nuclear weapon and a strategic nuclear weapon, let's just have a look at these two. So this is a tactical nuclear weapon. From this range, you can barely see what the effect would be. Right? So we'll zoom in. And this is a strategic nuclear weapon. So now we've described what weapons of mass destruction are and painted a bit of a broad picture. I want to talk about what would happen if Russia was going to use weapons of mass destruction. And I want to start by saying that I don't think that Russia will use nuclear weapons. We're going to skip over chemical weapons because they have too many downsides to any potential upside. If chemical weapons were used, the international community would be absolutely horrified by it, as with any of these attacks, but you wouldn't be able to wiggle your way out of it. You wouldn't be able to claim that, somebody else did this. It would be very obvious what happened. And so the other two options are potentially viable for different reasons. So with nuclear and biological weapons, Russia has already been edging around the potential use. And I know, as I said, I don't think this is going to happen, but they're leaving the option open. And the reason why I'm saying this is two different reasons. One is that they're painting the war in Ukraine as an existential threat. And that is one of the conditions where Russia has said that they will use nuclear weapons. The second is accusing the US of funding bioweaponry labs in Ukraine. And so we'll start with bioweapons. So one of the loud claims that Putin has about Ukraine is that they have bioweapon labs that are funded by the US, and they're researching genetically targeted viruses and genetically targeted diseases to only affect Russians.
What the fuck is this? Shut the
Which is insane. That's just crazy, right? That's science fiction for a number of reasons. And actually, I might just talk about this quickly now. How do you separate out the genes of the people that are in the nation of Russia from the ethnic Russians? And how would you tell which genes are only unique to ethnic Russians as opposed to the rest of the Slavic population or the entirety of Europe, or the world for that matter? It's insane. But I don't think they believe this. But the reason why they're saying these things is that if they did use bioweapons, they would be able to say, oh, it was a leak from a lab, right? These US funded labs, they've leaked the anthrax. And anthrax is what I think would be used if it was used by Russians, and probably in areas where these supposed bioweapon labs were. The main reason why is because anthrax isn't as contagious as something like smallpox. And so you would be able to contain it to that area. The response from other nations will be a bit muted as well, knowing that there isn't going to be a wave of smallpox victims hitting the entire planet. And so that would be it. Russia would blame the US and Ukraine for the anthrax, and they would drop it in areas where they had alleged that these bioweapon labs existed. And that would leave nuclear weapons. This is one of the ones where obviously we would be able to tell if it was Russia. We would be able to see a launch. The US is monitoring Russian missile sites, so we'd be able to tell who did it. Although I'm sure Russia would try to spread some kind of misinformation. So if nuclear weapons were going to be used, which I don't think they will be, I think this is incredibly unlikely and this is all very speculative, I think the most likely way they would be used would be a one-time, very limited strike against areas where there's either massed enemies or strategic targets that they can't crack. And they would use low-yield nuclear bombs to be able to give themselves as much wiggle room as possible to say that they had always reserved the right to use nuclear weapons first, and that this is an existential threat, and that they could have responded with larger nuclear bombs. And I think they would be banking on two things happening. One would be NATO taking time to respond if it responds aggressively at all. And two, banking on NATO not wanting to escalate further because there's still, 2,997 other warheads that could be used. This would absolutely be rolling the dice, because there may just be an instant retaliation, or NATO might respond conventionally and just join Ukraine and invade Russia. So throughout the Russo-Ukrainian War, which has been going for 8 years since Crimea was annexed, Putin has painted himself into a corner. He's told his people that this is an existential threat, that the West is coming for Russia, and that NATO is aggressively expanding up against Russia's borders so that it can not attack them with their defensive treaty. So that's kind of a problem, and he needs to win this war to be able to justify all of that rhetoric he's been throwing around earlier. And that is maybe why Putin may use weapons of mass destruction, but not weapons of mass seduction. One thing that's become abundantly clear is that We can't trust Russia with weapons of mass destruction anymore. And regardless of how this war turns out, we need to make sure that Russia at least divests itself of most of its nuclear arsenal. They'll never accept 100% disarmament, and that would be unrealistic. But I do think that given enough pressure, they will downsize their nuclear arsenal. Editing Bobby here, and I kind of didn't actually say what I wanted to say here, which is that we shouldn't ease up on the sanctions until Russia eases up on its weapons of mass destruction. The reaction from Putin is to just lob threats of nuclear warfare upon anybody who dares say anything that disappoints him or upsets him. The point of being a sovereign state is that that state decides its future, and threatening countries to stay out of a defensive alliance has only made that alliance stronger, but is just absurd. It's just made more people want to join it. If Putin had just left this alone, NATO would have just withered into irrelevance, but instead he's given it new life. But that's getting away from the point. Until Russia meaningfully shows that it has destroyed its biological weapon stockpile, and proves that it has no chemical weapon stockpiles, we shouldn't let them back into the global community. We should just ignore them. It'll be like primary school when you pretend a kid is dead. And when they say something, you just go, "What was that? Did I hear a ghost?" Right? And that's what we'll do every time Russia says, "Hey, you want to trade with me?" "Oh, did I hear a ghost? What was that?" Right? We'll just pretend they don't exist anymore until they're ready to play nice with all the other kids. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I feel like I got a bit scatterbrained there. Had to do a lot of trimming to get the video down. And it was a little bit on the loose side of things, but thank you for making it this far. I hope you learned something as per usual. I hope you enjoyed it, but yeah, let me know what you think. Do you think that Russia should have to divest its nuclear stockpile, or do you think it's perfectly fine? I mean, obviously there are other countries with huge nuclear stockpiles like the US, and to be quite honest, I'd like to see theirs reduced as well. But yeah, if you did like the video, please leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.